I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Where are our prophets now? Where are those messages God chooses to communicate divine revelation through? In the past, the Creator has sent prophets like Abraham, Siddhartha, Jesus, Muhammad, and many more. Maybe our higher power has switched tactics since we reinterpret God's words as soon as the Creator's prophets leave us. Could it be that Spirit talks to each one of us individually and we haven't learned to listen? On Words of the Prophets, our modern prophets show us how to find the internal prophet that is the I Am, and we discuss the application of spiritual principles in all aspects of our lives. Love and light, everybody. I'm Reverend Phil, and I'm your host for Words of the Prophets. Today my guest is Rabbi Marvin Schwab of the Temple Beth Shalom here in Santa Fe. Welcome back.
Hello, Phil. Good to be back.
And if those of you who are asking, back from where? It's been about a year since the last show, but we finally strong-armed him, showed up at his door and said, I'm not leaving till you say yes. And he said yes.
What else could I do?
Okay, we're going to have fun today. Today's prophetic topic is A Great Miracle Happened There. Our topic can be found as an acronym by utilizing the Hebrew letters on each of the four sides of a dreidel. The four letters are Nun, Gimel, Hay, and Shin. Did I say that right?
Close.
Good.
Close.
What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the holiday of Hanukkah, what it isn't, and just for the rabbi will let you know when the services are at his temple. But just so I sound like I know what I'm talking about, it begins Tuesday, December 20th at sundown. How did I do?
Great.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we start with, some people may not know, what's a dreidel?
A dreidel is a Yiddish word that means sevivon in Hebrew. I just thought I'd throw that one in. It means top. It's something you spin. And it was designed to be something that would attract the interest of children and at the same time teach them about Hanukkah, which is why the four letters on the dreidel spell out, or the acronym for A Great Miracle Happened There, unless, of course, you have an Israeli dreidel, in which case it says A Great Miracle Happened Here.
Okay. So then what we're talking about is a location as opposed to a place and time.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Although I think that idea of a place in time as something that continues through time is also an important concept, because it opens it up to us to the idea that the miracle can happen again, which is part of why Hanukkah can be a troubling holiday.
Okay, we're gonna get to that.
We'll get back to that one.
Yeah. Hanukkah happens in December. It's usually near the winter solstice, but it's not like all the other winter solstice holidays. Hanukkah is really about an event, as opposed to just wanting to holiday for the winter solstice.
Though I think there are some Christians who would say that Christmas deals with an event, even though it may be a legal fiction, but we don't have to go there.
Yeah, we don't want to go there, but yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a historical event that's documented, you know.
Yes. Yeah. There's no question that the basis for the holiday really did take place. And it goes back to around 165 before the Common Era, where the Jews were under the Seleucid Empire, which was one of the four parts of Alexander the Great's empire, that the empire broke apart when Alexander died, with the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids up towards around Iraq, that area. And they wound up ruling over the land of Israel. And things were perhaps not great, but okay, until Antiochus IV rose to the throne as emperor and decided to unite his kingdom under a single religion. And being a man of very little ego, chose to have everyone worship him as God. So he declares himself to be Antiochus Epiphanes, God revealed, and demands that everybody start offering sacrifices to his statue. And to make that happen in Israel, he sends troops in And they wind up going to the little town of Modi'in, which is not far from Jerusalem. And the approach was to take leaders of the town and get them to offer sacrifices to the statue to say to the rest of the Jews that this was okay. Well, he happened to pick on a family that was a clan known as the Hasmoneans. And Judah, head of the clan, Mattathias, they asked them to come forward and offer a sacrifice to the statue of the emperor, and they're told they'll be rewarded. They'll get money and so forth. And they refuse because they are from the tribe of Levi, and they're from a subset in that tribe, who are the priests, the Kohanim in Hebrew. They can trace their lineage all the way back to Aaron in the Bible, Moses' brother. So they are truly the leaders, and they refuse.
I got to pop in just a quick question.
Sure.
When you say trace it, I mean, is there actual genealogy, or is this just theoretical?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I'm going to say both, because do we have absolute genealogical records that can trace back? No, that's lost in antiquity. But in terms of tribal membership, that's pretty much an absolute. They've done DNA studies and RNA studies that show that people who believe they are from the tribe of Levi really are related. There's a particular gene that they seem to have in common. And tribal membership and household membership in Judaism to this day is passed father to son. Now, you're in Orthodox Judaism, you are a Jew if your mother was Jewish, but still your tribal membership and household membership, quote unquote, are you in the house of David or not, is passed father to son.
So when we talk about lineage, we're not talking about a direct descendant. We're talking about descending from what you're saying, one of the tribes.
Well, I mean, yes and no. It's one of those things that I don't believe that anybody could absolutely prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that they were related to Aaron.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, this has been a tradition within Judaism for something like 3,000 years.
So this is more of an oral kind of tradition then?
Somewhat.
Okay.
I mean, if push comes to shove, the term is that everybody who claims to be a Kohen, a priest, is a Kohen Safek, which means there's some doubt, because through the generations, we can't be sure if there was some break in the chain. But as I say, the genetic studies certainly tend to show that they're all related in terms of that tribe. And people who are Jews who are not part of that tribe don't have that one particular gene.
Is this true of the other tribes as well?
I think with the other tribes it's much harder to prove, because within the tribe of Levi there was more of a tendency to marry within the tribe. And I don't know that anyone has tried to do a study to see if, say, Moroccan Jews are related to Jews who are from Russia. I don't know that any kind of a study like that has been done.
Okay. Back to the narrative. I'm sorry. I was curious about that.
It's fine. So the Hasmoneans refuse to offer the sacrifice. So the soldiers go to somebody else in the town, also a Kohen, also a leader, who agrees. And when he steps forward to offer the sacrifice, Judah and Mattathias and the clan kill him and kill the soldiers. They turn to the townspeople and they say, basically, as you might imagine, this is not going to be a good place to be, right? You know? So we're going to head off into the hills and we're going to fight these Greco-Assyrians, as they're sometimes known. And as it turns out, this becomes guerrilla warfare. It is, in my understanding, the first, or at least one of the first, ever recorded of this kind of guerrilla warfare where you have an occupying force trying to control an indigenous uprising. And even though the Jews are vastly outnumbered, they win. And we become an independent state. And that happens in 165 before the Common Era. Now the Hanukkah part, Hanukkah itself, the word means dedication.
Okay.
So the this group who comes to be called the Maccabees, and they're called the Maccabees not because that's their name, but because of their battle cry. When they charged into battle, they screamed, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, which is Hebrew for who is like you, O God, amongst the mighty. And if you take the initials of those words in Hebrew, it spells Maccabee. So they come to be known as the Maccabees. These are warriors, which is not too surprising because that's the history of the tribe of Levi. When Dinah is raped, she's one of the daughters of Jacob, and Levi and Simeon are part of the sons of Jacob. When she gets raped, they ultimately go in, Levi and Simeon, and kill all the people in the town of Shechem because of this rape. Later on, in the incident of the golden calf in Exodus, Moses, who by the way is from the tribe of Levi, as is Aaron, Moses turns to his tribe mates and says, strap on your swords and go out and kill everybody who was truly worshiping the golden calf. And in that day they kill 3,000 of their cousins, if you will. So the tribe of Levi and the image of the quote, priest, the Kohen, within Jewish tradition, is not some ascetic sitting on a hilltop. These are people who are charged with defending the sanctuary and defending the faith. So, at any rate, they reclaim the temple, which had been defiled by the offering of pigs on the altar, worship to the statue of the emperor. They clean all that stuff out. They decide to rekindle what's called the Ner Tamid, the eternal light or flame in the temple. And this is where some people think the miracle is. They find one container of oil, of olive oil, for this lamp that had not been defiled by the Greeks or the Greco-Assyrians. And they put that into the lamp, they relight it, it's enough for one day, and the story is that it lasts for 8. The interesting part about that story of the miracle is it doesn't appear, it's not in the book of Maccabees, which, by the way, is not in the Jewish Bible, and we'll come back to that. But it doesn't appear until Jewish oral tradition, in its second wave, gets written down, which is around the year 400. So somewhere around 550, 600 years after the fact, does the story of the miracle of the oil appear.
Why do you think that is?
Well, there are a couple of possibilities. I think the Maccabees were more enchanted with their victory, and that the miracle was that the few defeated the many, the weak defeated the mighty, and that becomes the miracle. And you know, Phil, that's one of the basic definitions of many Jewish holidays. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat.
Yes.
And so there are special foods that go with the holidays, including Hanukkah, of course. So the Maccabees weren't so intent on that thing with the oil. Later on, the rabbis are trying to explain why the festival is 8 days long. And in reality, what the reason the holiday comes about when it does is because the Maccabees say we need to remember this time of rededication of the temple, which comes on the Jewish calendar, Kislev, interestingly enough, the 25th, which when you couple it to a solar calendar varies a bit because the Jewish calendar is lunar with a solar correction. But when they take back the temple, they want to rededicate it the way the temple had always been dedicated. The first temple by Solomon, the second temple when the Jews come back from exile. And it's done at a holiday called Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths. And it was the most important holiday in the ancient Jewish ritual calendar. It's called, in Hebrew, Zman Simchatenu, the time of our rejoicing. It's the end of the harvest festival. As a matter of fact, it's where the pilgrims get the idea for Thanksgiving in this country.
Okay.
And that's when the temple was dedicated. And so the Maccabees look at the calendar. It's only been a couple of months. They weren't able to celebrate it in its proper time. So let's celebrate it now. We'll dedicate the temple. And from now on, everybody should celebrate this second festival at this time to celebrate this victory, much as, we commemorate not a victory, but we commemorate December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. We commemorate what used to be Armistice Day, which is now Veterans Day.
Yes.
But these kinds of things, these historical events become the purpose of a holiday, even July 4th.
So let's go back on the soil for a second.
Okay.
My understanding is, that the miracle had lasted 8 days, and 8 days was the amount of time it was going to take to process and make ready new oil.
Yes.
So, this was like a big thing.
Yes, and in fact, there's a discussion in Jewish tradition about when you light the Hanukkah menorah, the candelabra, or if you're using oil lamps, either way, do you start with 8 and then each night take one away to show how many days are left in the holiday? Or do you start with 1 and then add to it? And the ultimate decision is you start with 1 and add 1 each night to show the increase in the miracle. Plus, there's a principle that you're allowed to increase holiness, but not decrease. So if you're taking 1 candle away or 1 oil lamp away each night, you're decreasing it.
2 things about that. One is, read somewhere that there was also an allowance to have 1 candle per person in the household.
Well, that's sometimes done, or was sometimes done, on Shabbat, on Friday night, as you're bringing in the Sabbath. But likewise, it's the same thing. If you start with 2 candles, and then if you add 1 because you have a child, then another one for another child, when those children become adults and leave home, you're not allowed to reduce the number of candles that you're using, because you're not allowed to reduce the holiness.
And then you have the 9th candle, which is the one that stays lit.
Right. That's because we are a very practical religion. Here's why. Here's what's going on. In the ancient world, they were using oil lamps for light in the home. And when you began to use oil lamps for Hanukkah, and you're lighting these extra lamps and you're using olive oil, it's expensive. It is today, it was then. But the light is considered too holy to use. So now you're lighting this thing which would illuminate your home, you're not allowed to use the light. What do? So you have this extra candle or extra oil lamp called the shamash, shamas in Yiddish, which means the server. And you use the light from that, but not the light from the others, as if you could separate the light. Okay? But there is that comment in the prayers that are said when you light the candles, Hanerot, now I can't remember the quote in Hebrew, but it says, these lights are holy. Kadosh Haim. Hanerot halalu, these lights are holy.
So we've got these warrior priests who,
yes,
create this incredible victory. We have this miracle. We have this holiday. You made the comment that the book of Maccabees is not part of the Jewish Bible. Why not?
Well, there are 3 reasons that I think of. One is the company line. And that is that when the Bible was being canonized, when it was being assembled and closed off as this is part of the Holy Scripture and this is not, you have to remember the word Bible means book. And there weren't books in those days. You had separate scrolls. So you had the scroll of the 5 books of Moses, the Torah. You had the scroll of Isaiah, the scroll of Elijah, the Megillah, the scroll of Esther, the book of Ruth, Lamentations, all of these things. How do you determine what's within the boundary of Holy Scripture and what is not? And when the rabbis set out to do that, the book of Maccabees was too recent to be holy. And that's one of the key things in the ancient world, and even I think today, there's a sense that if something is old, there's an element of sacredness about it. The book of Maccabees was too recent. It was also, now we're getting into the other parts of it, it was too political.
Well, let's back up to the too recent for a second, then we'll get to the political. All that this stood for, we have the holiday was by that time already in force, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
They were celebrating Hanukkah.
Yes.
So they could celebrate the holiday, but they wouldn't. The story of it is not part of. I'm just a little.
There's an issue here of you celebrate the fact that we reclaimed the temple and rededicated it. But the reality is you're not really celebrating the Maccabees.
Okay.
Now we get into the political aspects of it.
Okay.
The book of Maccabees doesn't talk about the miracle of the oil, it talks about the military victory. Now, if you are a rabbi and you're now under Roman occupation, and by the way, you're under Roman occupation because the Maccabees invite them in after they've ruled for 100 and some years. They invite the Romans to come in because, this is the part we don't usually talk about, there was a civil war. Let me back up a little bit. You have the situation where the Maccabees win. They drive the Greco-Assyrians out. We are now an independent country. And in those days, what did you have? You had an emperor or a king. Our king is supposed to be from the house of David, part of the lineage of the Davidic dynasty from King David.
So the house of David, we're talking now, as we talked earlier, is really the tribe.
No, it's a subset within the tribe.
Okay.
Okay? It's a subset within the tribe. And what happens instead is the Hasmoneans, also known as the Maccabees, install themselves as kings. So they coalesce the priesthood and the kingship, which historically was a major no-no in Judaism. It's too much of a concentration of power. So we're fighting, in part, a civil war while they're ruling because people want someone from the house of David. If you're going to reestablish a kingship, it ought to be from the house of David. Nobody would have argued if the Maccabees had installed themselves as the high priest and passed that from generation to generation. But because they brought the kingship and the priesthood together, now it's a problem. And the rabbis are very aware of that. So on one hand, they're heroes for getting us religious freedom and allowing us to survive, because this idea of the emperor worship was not just that alone, but the emperor Antiochus outlawed the major practices of Judaism. We weren't allowed to observe the Sabbath. We weren't allowed to keep kosher, the dietary laws. We weren't allowed to study Torah, and we weren't allowed to circumcise our sons. Because if you're going to be part of a Greek empire, you're going to go to the gym, the gymnasium, you're going to compete in athletic events, and you're going to do that naked. And you don't want to look different. So you outlaw circumcision so that everybody looks alike. You don't let anyone study their religion. So the Maccabees are at the foundation of it. They're not only fighting against idolatry, they're fighting for the survival of Judaism. And there's a dynamic tension that exists between Hellenism and Judaism. And the Maccabees are the ones that are fighting for Judaism.
During those times, leading up to those times, and even after those times, I know it goes in, it was part of the Egyptian thing, it was part of the Greek thing, it was part of the Roman thing, that most of the times emperors declared themselves divine.
Right.
So I mean, is this also a factor in that, not combining the two?
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of it. See, one of the things, when Alexander the Great comes through Israel, the Jews apparently treated him with respect. He treated us with respect and gave us religious freedom, which meant we were free from having to worship him because he himself installed himself in that way. You were supposed to worship him. So for us, we're the ones where this idea of the King of Kings comes from. You may have an earthly king, as we did with King Saul and David and Solomon and so forth, but the ultimate king is God. And on the Jewish High Holy Days, we still approach God with the words Avinu Malkeinu, literally, our Father, our King. And so there is this sense of being a kind and forgiving parent, but also being aware of the kingship. And you have to remember that in the ancient world, the king had absolute power of life and death over his subjects. You come into the presence of the king uninvited, and the guards put you to death. We don't deal quite that way with it. But even so, if you arrive at the White House uninvited and unescorted, you get put in jail. So we still have this thing about protecting our leaders. So kingship was a very, very powerful element. And so when you ask if this thing of kings declaring themselves to be God on earth was one reason why we didn't want to mix, yes, that was part of it. Also, I think the worship of the human form, which the Greeks seem to represent, was another element. Although, we do have a teaching in Judaism that anybody who denigrates the sex organs or the act of sex is denigrating God, because God's responsible for the way we're made and put together.
Yeah.
So it's not that we don't appreciate the human form, we just don't worship it.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect.
I want to back up again.
Sure.
What, besides the burning of the candle, does it take to rededicate a temple?
Well, again, you have to cleanse it, which I think literally means washing it and scrubbing it and get the idols out of it and so forth. And then there are, in the typical dedication, there are the right sacrifices that are offered, in this case not pigs, which is what the Greeks had been doing, but only kosher animals. There's going to be a libation of olive oil, where you pour oil on the altar. If you go back in the book of Genesis to when Jacob has his dream of the ladder, when he wakes up in the morning, he sets up a stone pillar and pours oil on it to dedicate it to God. And so this, and even today, for those of the audience who may be old enough to remember when Queen Elizabeth went through a coronation, which I remember, I'm that old, she knelt down and they poured oil on her head to anoint her to be king, or queen rather. And so the same thing is done with the altar. There's that kind of thing. And then there's the blood of the sacrifices. So there are those sorts of things that go on. Whether or not there were any particular prayers of dedication that were said, I can't know for sure.
Was, how do I want to ask this question? In the defiling of the temple, were books destroyed? Were scrolls destroyed? Because that usually was the case.
Yeah, what you, I think, are pretty much have to believe that there were. I don't know that there's anything that records that the scrolls were burned and so forth. But if the emperor's outlawing the study of Torah, you would imagine that he would destroy the Torahs that he found or that his troops found. So there would be some of that, but those writings get preserved in other locations. My particular theory is that the community at the Dead Sea at Qumran were people that left, and you find all the books of the Bible recorded in the Dead Sea Scrolls except the book of Esther.
Which means?
Well, there are a variety of reasons why Esther may not have been included. It centers on a woman. It centers on the use of her sexuality. And they were not that kind of a community, perhaps. There are some questions sometimes about whether or not the book of Esther is truly a historical book. It's also the only book in the Bible that never mentions God. And that may be the ultimate reason why it was not preserved in that community.
So, the popular theory is there's a sect of Judaism called the Essenes, and that's who were the people who preserved and buried the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right.
Where, if any place, do they show up in the Old Testament?
Oh, they don't.
They don't at all.
No.
So
this is going to be post-biblical. As again, the book of Maccabees is not in the Bible from 165 before the Common Era. then the Essenes are not going to be there either, because if the Essenes split off after the Maccabees come to power, then it's all post-biblical. I think, in fact, the only place you hear about the Essenes is in some of the writings of Josephus, and he may have picked it up from somebody else. But it's not particularly clear. It's a very facile kind of association of the Essenes as a Jewish cult with the Dead Sea Scrolls. I don't have the archaeological evidence to say that it wasn't, that's not who was there, but it's that intertestamental period between the time when the Jewish scriptures are sealed off and the Christian scriptures begin to be written is a fascinating time in history.
What date were the Jewish scriptures sealed?
Well, again, the actual canonization, as it's called, of the scriptures happens probably before the year 200 of the Common Era and after the year 100, because there's a debate that's recorded in Talmud and Jewish oral tradition about this going on and how they decide what books would be in it. So based on the rabbis who are taking part in that discussion, that's the time. And again, if they're under Roman occupation, which they are they going to want to include in our canon, in our Holy Scriptures, a scroll that extols military action? We did it before and we can do it again. We beat the Greeks, now let's beat the Romans. Well, we try 3 times. We revolt 3 times against the Romans. And in fact, in the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Romans have to bring the 10th Legion all the way from England to put down the Jewish revolt that time. And you can still find in the old city of Jerusalem, you go through the Jaffa Gate, you go to a little side street, you turn left, and there's this little, very tiny little plaza area, almost like a courtyard. And there is the remains of a column that was inscribed by the Roman 10th Legion. It's still there to this day. I've seen it.
Okay.
So, that's
the way you were describing it. I had a feeling you'd been there.
Oh, yes, a number of times. So, that thing about we can revolt and win is part of what drives us. Until the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Roman Empire had expanded every single year. From the Bar Kokhba revolt on, it contracted every year. So I take a little pride, whether justified or not, in the Jewish rebellion having brought down the Roman Empire, but I'm sure there are other factors involved as well. So for the rabbis who are putting together, again, the canon of Jewish tradition, there are some reasons why they don't want to put the Book of Maccabees in. It's too recent. It would be something that could be seen as an exhortation to the Jews to rebel, and they're trying to sort of keep a lid on it, make sure we survive the Roman occupation. And then lastly, it's the fact that the Maccabees, the heroes of the story of Hanukkah, are usurpers of the throne. And so the rabbis are going to have some trouble, saying, yay, let's cheer the Maccabees, when they, in their history, they realize that, yes, there was a war that was fought, a civil war, as well as the Revolutionary War against the Seleucid Empire. And, again, the Maccabees usurped the throne, coalesced the kingship and the priesthood, which is seen as a terrible concentration of power. So for those reasons, they're going to keep the Book of Maccabees from being in the Jewish Bible. On the other hand, as you pointed out, this is a festival that is celebrating something that we want to celebrate. So they can't do away with Hanukkah, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately then the miracle of the oil gets explained, and that's why we eat potato pancakes, because they're fried in oil.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you're in Israel, excuse me, you might not find people eating potato pancakes, but instead they'll be eating suf ganiyot, which are jelly donuts.
I like that tradition better.
Isn't that a great tradition? And the year that I lived there, going back to 1980 to 81, you could not find jelly donuts in Israel at all until Hanukkah began to approach. It was a seasonal food. You ate it at Hanukkah, And when Hanukkah was over, they disappeared and not to be seen again for another year. So, and the reason again is because donuts are fried in oil.
And making it something special as
Right.
well.
Right.
I want to go back on this concept of the house of David within the tribe. How does that come about? How does that work? I mean, does the house of David actually start with David?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. David, of course, marries King Saul's daughter, Michal. So he's part of the court of King Saul. But Saul, we believed, suffered from depression. There are a variety of things. And ultimately, when Saul is ready to go to battle, he's waiting for the prophet to show up to offer a sacrifice so that the battle will be successful. After 3 days' wait, he gives up and offers a sacrifice himself. And of course, as soon as that happens, that's when the prophet shows up and says, Saul, you've committed a huge transgression, and for this reason, the crown of the kingship will be taken from you. And that's what allows David to become king when Saul dies in battle. And David, being the warrior that he is, and well versed in the ways of the kingship, makes sure that Michal, King Saul's daughter, is put in isolation so that she never has any children who could then reclaim the throne. So the only valid line in terms of the monarchy is now King David. And he has many children, but the kingship passes to King Saul. And it's when Saul dies that the kingdom splits into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom is seen as the house of David. That's where Jerusalem is. The northern kingdom eventually settles in at least its temple settles in the tribe of Dan in the north. And that becomes an important piece because people make pilgrimage to the temple. And the Torah only says, offer the sacrifices and make pilgrimage to that place where I cause my name to dwell. So that could be Jerusalem, it could be Shiloh, and it was initially, and then ultimately Dan. And the reason they do that, the reason the northern tribes in their kingdom want their own temple, is because they don't want pilgrims going down to the south to the other kingdom and bringing all that income. Much like the Super Bowl today or the Olympics. The pilgrims come, right? The pilgrims come, they need a place to stay, they need food to eat, they want to take souvenirs home, and they have to buy animals for the sacrifices.
So 2 kingdoms. Are we talking then, do we have a division within that house of David that is?
Probably not, but the reality is what happens is the Babylonians ultimately conquer the northern kingdom and carry those tribes off into exile, and they become known as the lost 10 tribes of Israel because they simply assimilated into the surrounding cultures and were lost. So what you have left are the tribe of Israel, the tribe of, you have the tribe of Benjamin and Levi. And David is not part of Levi. So the house of David is this subset. And there was a biblical commentator, a sage in Judaism, who, by the way, was in the south of France, who comes to be known as Rashi. Rashi died about 910 years ago, roughly. And he apparently had the genealogy and could trace his lineage back to King David. So in the modern world, if you could trace your lineage to Rashi, then you knew you were related to King David. And I actually know people, one of my teachers in Jerusalem has a family tree that shows that he is descended from Rashi, and therefore he's from the house of David, and who knows, could have been the Messiah.
Interesting. Let's talk about that.
Yes.
The Messiah.
Okay.
I don't think a lot of people really understand what that means and where it originated. Do you want to start with that?
Sure. The word Messiah comes from the English Mashiach, and it means the one who has had oil poured on his head to be anointed as king of the Jews. It's that simple and that straightforward. Just as I talked about Queen Elizabeth, the tradition hasn't changed in terms of making somebody a king. There's this anointing with oil. And when you translate Mashiach into Greek, the word is Christos, which also comes into English as Christ. So when someone speaks about Jesus Christ, they're really saying Jesus the Messiah, Jesus who is King of the Jews.
The Anointed One.
The Anointed One, right.
So we are doing exactly what the Maccabees wanted to do. Because Jesus was a rabbi and we're making him king.
Well, actually, Jesus was not a rabbi.
Okay.
Because the term rabbi doesn't get used until the year 40 of the Common Era, which is 7 years after Jesus was crucified.
So
he was never called rabbi. He was simply a sage.
Okay.
Okay?
And
Now,
that differs from being a priest.
absolutely.
Because
Yes.
he doesn't have the lineage from the house.
Right. A
the
priest is a hereditary position. You are a Kohen because your father was a Kohen.
Okay.
The rabbi, the rabbinate, if you will, is based as a meritocracy. If you are intelligent enough to do the study, it doesn't matter what your lineage is, you can become a rabbi. Ta-da! So, sorry. So,
That's okay.
so there is this question of, this is one of the places where you begin to see this breakdown in leadership as having been passed as a monarchy, as a dynasty, etc., because there are stories in the Bible that clearly show that just because you're the firstborn son, you may not be suitable to lead the clan. Joseph comes to mind. He is given the coat of many colors as a symbol of his ultimate leadership of the group. And so the rabbi, what happens is the Maccabees ultimately are usurpers of the throne. If you're supposed to be from the house of David, and they're not, because they can't be, because David was not from the tribe of Levi, they should not have been kings. Now, my belief is that that's why the Essenes split off. There's a group, whether they're called the Essenes or not, that goes from Jerusalem and goes down to the Dead Sea to get away from what they see as a corrupt and an improper kingship. And they then begin to write about the sons of light fighting the sons of darkness. What they're talking about is the Jews who want to see the proper king installed on the throne fighting against the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabees, who are now on the throne. And what happens is they're the ones, it's because of the Maccabees and the fact that they usurped the throne that you begin to get what's called a messianic fervor. The people want a Messiah from the house of David. In other words, someone anointed to be king, to sit on the throne, who's from the proper lineage. Since there are people around who can trace their lineage back to King David, they want one of them to be king. So that's what they're looking for. That's where the messianism comes from in Judaism.
But Jesus doesn't fulfill that requirement.
Well, in my estimation, no, he doesn't. And it's one of the issues when people are asked, why didn't the Jews accept Jesus as the Messiah? Well, for one thing, he never ruled. If you're going to be a Messiah, you have to be king. He was never king. And to declare yourself to be, quote, king of the Jews was to put yourself into a state of revolt, sedition, treason against Rome, for which, guess what? They would crucify you, which is what they ultimately do to Jesus and another 3,000 men who also declare themselves to be king of the Jews. The problem you get into is if you accept virgin birth, then Joseph wasn't Jesus' father, and Mary's lineage doesn't matter because household membership and tribal membership are passed father to son. So there are problems. If you look at Mark doesn't have a virgin birth. So if Joseph really is the father, then perhaps Jesus might qualify, but mainstream Christianity says, no, Joseph is not the father. Therefore, guess what? You have a problem with the heritage and with whether or not Jesus could in fact be, quote, the Messiah, the one from the house of David, anointed to be king.
So we call him a sage. We call him a prophet.
Well, technically we don't call him a prophet for a variety of reasons, including prophecy gets cut off when the first temple is destroyed in Jewish tradition. But
Why?
to call him, why? This is leading into your show on prophecy.
Yes.
But part of it is, the joke in today's world is when we speak to God, it's called prayer. When God speaks to us, it's called paranoid schizophrenia. And it becomes very difficult. And earlier in my career, in another city, there was a woman who would call me on a routine basis because she wanted to give me this great message that God had for the Jews that God had given her, and she needed to give it to me so I could give it to all the Jews. I think she greatly overestimated my position in the Jewish world. But one day she called me, and she sounded very lucid and explained to me that she was actually, indeed, a paranoid schizophrenic, and when she didn't take her medicine, she could not tell if the voices she was hearing were her disease or were God. And if you're going to have a religion, once there's some initial revelation, something you coalesce around, you can't have somebody stand up in the middle of your worship service, in the middle of your rituals, and say, "Thus said the Lord God who appeared to me last night in a vision. You're doing it all wrong." How do you determine whether or not that's God's voice or not? In fact, Deuteronomy says, false prophets will arise among you. How do you tell if they're a false prophet? They'll foretell the future. They'll work a miracle. What makes them a false prophet? In Deuteronomy it says, if they ask you to go worship other gods you haven't known, they're a false prophet, and what do? You kill them. In biblical times.
So then the flip side makes them the prophet, that if they don't tell you to worship a different God, but tell you how to worship differently to the same God.
Well, again, we have, one of the principles in Judaism is we have scripture and we have tradition, and this is the way it's supposed to be done. And therefore, prophecy per se, God speaking directly to humans in today's world, is not something we embrace as religion. Now, that doesn't mean God is not involved in our lives. I'm fond of saying that there were things that have happened in my life that at the time may have seemed like a terrible, awful thing, yet a blessing has come from it. When I look back over these things, I can see God's fingerprints in my life. But has God ever said to me, "You shall be a rabbi, you're the chosen one"? No. I feel that we have free will in life, and this is a basic teaching of Judaism. Does God open doors for us? Yes. Do we go through those doors? Our choice. And that there's a huge difference there.
I'll share a quick story.
Sure.
Just let you comment if you want. Because I had an experience, it was 9/11. I had radio shows that had ended right before, it was like September 1st. I had a radio show called Good Company. I thought I had to go back to school, and so I needed to free up some time. I was also DJing a rock and roll show at the same time. So that would free up 6-7 hours of a week for me. Then I find out I don't have to go back to school. They were going to grandfather in the credentials I had to get the license I was working at. And that was fine. Then 9/11 happens, and I wind up doing a show on radio on the 12th, that Wednesday night, with somebody who wanted to talk about what happened, and they got hooked with me together, and we did this show. And it was everything my original show I had wanted it to be, because my original show was only a half hour, wanted it an hour. This guy had an hour slot. This guy had a weekday night slot. I had a Saturday afternoon slot. Nobody was calling in because they were out doing whatever. We had 7 people call in that night, or 8 people call in that night. Anyway, to make the story quick, Thursday morning, as is my the way I start my day in meditation. And one of those rare days where my mind was just completely empty. I mean, that doesn't happen too often. And I'm sitting there meditating, and all of a sudden there's this booming voice in my head that says, Phil, the radio is part of your ministry. Do not forsake it. Two things. It wasn't my voice because it was too booming, and I never used the word forsake. I mean, so to me, God talked to me. Yeah, and within a month, I was back on the air again. I mean, so I believe that God talks to people. And yeah, sometimes I think we label them schizophrenic when they shouldn't be, but that's another show for another time.
There's an essential element here, Phil. And the element is God wasn't telling you, put your child in a microwave oven to drive the demons out.
No.
And God wasn't telling you, go kill somebody because
exactly.
they're, And so whatever there's a partnership between us and God. There's a synergy, and we are supposed to use the brain that God gave us. And you did. You could have ignored whatever that message was, whatever its source was. You pursued what you needed to pursue because otherwise you wouldn't have been on the radio again. And I'm not saying that there aren't signs, if you will, but you didn't have a vision of God speaking to you. You heard something in your head and you chose to act on it. And I think that, and that it made sense in the rational world, so-called, in which we live, the physical world, then to me it passes muster. I will tell you, I don't for a moment believe that God spoke to, I'm trying to remember the name of the evangelist, and told him that if he didn't raise $6 million, God was going to call him home.
He was going to jump off the steeple.
Right. Oral Roberts, take a swan dive off his prayer tower, please. I think it's a great fundraising gimmick, but I believe it was a gimmick. There are these differences. Again, when you look back at your life and you see how things work, and it feels like, there was this presence. The story that I love is a man dies, goes to heaven and meets God, and says to God, I really don't understand. When times were good, I'd walk along the beach and I'd look behind me and I'd see 2 sets of footprints.
Oh, yeah.
So I knew you were with me, right? But when times were bad, I'd look behind me and I'd see only 1 set of footprints. Why did you forsake me, to use your
God's
word?
response, right? I was carrying you.
Right.
Yes.
I didn't forsake you. I was carrying you. We look back and we can see elements in our lives that really fit that kind of piece. And I'm a very mystical rationalist or rational mystic. I'm never quite sure on which side I come down, but there are these pieces. Do I think that God's hand was in the victory of the Maccabees? Yeah. Was it their choice to start the war? Yeah, they had free will. They could have left things as they were. They chose not to. So what we do becomes an important piece. And I also think that when you light the Hanukkah menorah, you're supposed to put it in the window to publicize the miracle. There are a variety of elements. When you have a symbol, they're not necessarily monolithic in what they stand for. So the Hanukkah menorah brings light into a dark world. It's an affirmation of faith. It's a statement we still exist. It's a statement that we are capable of bringing light into the world. And there's a line in the morning prayers in Judaism about God, you clothe the naked. And I'm fond of saying, I've never seen a pair of pants that said, made by God, right?
Made in heaven.
Made in heaven. But I will tell you this. My wife and I went through our closets yesterday, and we have 2 enormous bags and a box of very good clothes to give to the shelter here in Santa Fe. And God clothing the naked? Yeah, because God teaches us to care about each other and how to do that, and that we should do that. And for those people who are able to wear those clothes, including some of the jackets in this cold winter, that will be, quote, a godsend.
Yes.
We make God manifest in this world by what we do.
Or not do.
Or not do.
Exactly.
And so that, I think, becomes the important piece. And Hanukkah is the time of dedication, not of some ancient temple. It shouldn't just be some historical thing. It's a time for us to dedicate this temple of the soul to good in the world, to kindness, and to make this world what we want it to be.
I'm going to use that as a segue. We got about 3 minutes left. Do you want to let people know what your service schedule is at Temple Beth Shalom?
Yes, we have Friday night services at 6:30 every Friday night. Our Saturday morning services, we begin with lox bagels and cream cheese at about 9:15. Eating is, of course, a Jewish endeavor. At 9:30 to 10:30, we study the Torah portion of the week, the reading, and then we have a service from 10:30 to 11:30. And this year, on December 23rd, which is Friday night, it's going to be a very interesting service. It's Hanukkah. Bring your Hanukkah menorahs to light the candles as part of the Shabbat service. We're also going to put into its display case and decommission the first Torah scroll ever to come into the territory of New Mexico.
Wow.
And the last children to read from it for their bar bat mitzvah were twins, were the 5th generation of a founding family of our congregation to participate in the congregation. They became bar bat mitzvah by reading the 10 Commandments.
And I think with that, we're going to have to put a wrap on this. Rabbi, thank you so much. Just to let you know, he kind of let the cat out of the bag. We're going to be doing a show coming up in the next month or so on the books of the prophets and their impact on society, and that's why he made that reference. And you'll be part of it.
Gladly.
Excellent. And I just want to throw out there that this is public access television. You're the public. Let us hear from you. What kind of shows do you want to see? What kind of shows do you not want to see? Maybe you want to do a show. Maybe you got a question about something that was said on a show. You know, we're here for you. You're not here for us. So get involved. Let us hear from you. Also, just quickly, I am a counselor as well as a minister. I do spiritual counseling, and I don't believe that we could actually, we're talking about schizophrenia, I don't believe in a system that says if God talks to you, you got to be schizophrenic. If you pray too much, you got to be obsessive and compulsive. You know, so I think spirit is an essential component to our healing. And if that sounds like interesting stuff, call me. We can use spirit to heal anything and everything. I don't try to convert you. If you watch the show, you know that I'm just across the board. I honor all paths. And so I'm not going to here to convert you. We're going to take what you bring and work with it. And it's time to wrap up. So love and light to everybody, and we'll see you next week. Blessings. I'm Reverend Phil, and I've been your host for Words of the Prophets. Thank you for tuning in. Please join me again next week, same time, same channel, for more Words of the Prophets.